Welcome to this explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're diving into a topic that is quietly, almost invisibly reshaping the global balance of power. We're talking about the staggering economic gap that's opened up between the United States and Europe. Economists are calling it the Great Divergence. And honestly, to understand the modern world, you absolutely have to understand what's happening right here. So, get comfortable and let's get started. Okay, let's jump right into part one, the Mississippi benchmark. This gives us our baseline, and it's going to completely challenge how we view the major Western powers. So, you might assume that historic global powerhouses are all playing in the exact same economic league, right? Well, let's look at the Mississippi benchmark. Mississippi is currently the poor state in the U.S., yet its GDP per capita sits at $53,872. Now look at France. France sits at just over $48,000. The UK is at $52,432. Let that sink in for a second. The absolute poorest U.S. state generates more economic output per person than several of the most prominent, heavily industrialized nations in Western Europe. And just to be totally clear, this isn't some weird, isolated anomaly. Look at the major European economies in 2024. The United States average is soaring at over $86,000 per capita. Germany, which is supposed to be Europe's economic engine, is trailing way behind at around $55,000. Italy sits all the way down near $40,000. So overall, the EU average is roughly half the US average. How on earth did a gap this massive open up between close allies? That brings us to Section 2, tracing the historical divergence. Because here is a crazy fact. Back in 1990, the US and the European Union were essentially at perfect parity in output per hour. They were totally neck and neck. So what happened? Well, it's a timeline of compounding historical crises. Back in 2000, Europe largely missed out on the massive productivity boom of the dot-com and IT revolution. Then we hit the 2008 financial crisis, and the US simply recovered a lot faster. Fast forward to 2010 through 2012, and the Eurozone's sovereign debt crisis practically cost Southern Europe an entire decade of growth. And most recently, in 2022, the war in Ukraine triggered a devastating energy shock for the entire continent. It has just been crisis after crisis. The severity of this really can't be overstated. European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde recently issued a super blunt warning about this. She pointed out that Europe's weaknesses don't always look like dramatic, overnight crashes. Instead, they erode growth quietly. And she warned that another 6 years of inaction wouldn't just be disappointing, it would be totally irresponsible. And you can see that quiet erosion perfectly when you look at the post-pandemic data. Since 2019, U.S. productivity per person employed grew by a staggering 44%. The euro area? Just 20%. The United States didn't just recover from the pandemic, it literally put its foot on the gas and accelerated away from Europe. So the gap is real. Now we have to ask why. Let's move into Section 3, Root Causes of Stagnation, pulling from a landmark report by former ECB President Mario Draghi. Draghi delivered this massive €800 billion diagnosis of the European market, and he hit the nail on the head. He identified three huge structural anchors holding the continent back: a glaring tech innovation gap, cripplingly high energy costs, and highly fragmented capital markets. Let's start with those fragmented markets. 110%. That is a wild number. According to the ECB, the internal trade barriers that still exist between EU member states essentially act like a massive 110% tariff on services. Imagine trying to grow a cross-border business when you're effectively paying a 110% penalty just to operate in a neighboring country. It completely stifles internal growth. Then you have the harsh reality of energy. EU industrial electricity prices are currently 158% higher than in the US. In fact, depending on the month, European factories are paying 2 to 4 times more for energy than their American competitors. If you're manufacturing anything, literally anything, that base cost difference is absolutely devastating to your ability to compete globally. And then there's the sheer scale of the technology gap. The U.S. Magnificent Seven tech stocks, companies like Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, they have a combined market cap exceeding $15 trillion. To put that in perspective, these 7 American companies easily outvalue entire European national stock exchanges. Europe simply does not have a native equivalent to this kind of digital age wealth generation. But, of course, there's a very important yes, but to all of this.
And that brings us to Section 4, the quality of life debate. We have to acknowledge the European model.
What are Europeans getting in exchange for that lower GDP? Well, let's look at the data objectively. On healthcare outcomes, EU citizens live longer, averaging around 81 years of life expectancy, compared to 78.4 in the US. And when we look at statutory work-life balance, the EU mandates at least 20 paid vacation days by law. The US federal mandate? 0. Europe has very intentionally chosen a model that prioritizes social stability, health, and leisure over raw, relentless economic output.
You can definitely see this in wealth inequality too. Measured by the Gini coefficient, where a lower number means more equality, we see the US at 0.39, while Germany and France sit at 0.30 and 0.29. It's undeniable that Europe features robust social safety nets designed to prevent the extreme highs and the extreme lows of the American system.
However, that safety net yields some highly surprising results when you look closely at median wealth per adult in 2024. The US median sits at $112,000. Italy actually beats it slightly at roughly 114,000 euros. But check out Germany. Despite the lower overall inequality in the country, the heavily skewed median wealth in Germany, the supposed rich powerhouse of Europe, is actually significantly lower than the US, at just under 70,000 euros.
So we have the macro data, and we understand the social trade-offs, but what does this divergence look like on the ground today? Let's get into Section 5, real-world industrial fallout.
50,000. That's the number of job cuts recently announced by Volkswagen in Germany. VW has long been the gold standard bellwether for European industrial might, but recently they reported a massive 53% drop in operating profit, and it's largely driven by high domestic costs and losing ground to Chinese and American tech and EV innovations.
VW CEO Oliver Blume put it incredibly starkly. He said, "The business model that has supported us for decades is not tenable anymore." And we really need to recognize that this isn't just about cars. Massive chemical companies like BASF and Dow are also actively shutting down incredibly energy-intensive plants across Europe. The math simply doesn't work for them anymore.
And when factories close and purchasing power drops, the fallout doesn't stay neatly contained in the economic sector, it moves directly to the ballot box. Welcome to Section 6, the political reckoning.
If we just neutrally reflect on the political realities of the 2024 European Parliament, populist parties now hold roughly 36% of the seats. Polling shows that intense economic anxiety, driven by a widespread expectation among everyday citizens that their living standards are going to fall, has fueled a massive cross-border populist surge. And this political fragmentation is actively destabilizing the major players. France went through 5 prime ministers in just 2 years amid budget crises. In Germany, populist parties are seeing huge polling surges as their industrial base shakes. And in the UK, the data shows a staggering £180 to £240 billion economic hit following Brexit, which is adding immense pressure to their entire political system.
So tying all this together, we arrive at Mario Draghi's ultimate bottom-line warning. He stated clearly, if Europe cannot become more productive, we will not be able to finance our social model. This is an existential challenge. That revered European way of life, the long vacations, the universal healthcare, the incredible social safety nets, it's all fundamentally at risk if the underlying productivity engine can't keep up with the rest of the world.
Which leaves us with the ultimate provocative question: can Europe actually finance its social model in the 21st century? The data clearly shows a massive divergence, but how Europe responds to this gap is going to define the future of the global economy. I hope this explainer helped structure this incredibly complex topic for you. Keep analyzing the data, keep asking questions, and I highly encourage you to dig deeper into these numbers yourself. Thank you so much for learning with me today.